Hey, it's Nikki, and today's episode is a special series called In the Loop, Communicating for Maximum Leadership Impact with my friends from Borshoff. I am a huge fan of the work Borshoff does to advance internal communication, and so happy that they have joined Gut Plus Science for a special series. Get ready for internal communication inspiration. There's so many nuggets of wisdom here.
Hey, it's Katherine Coble, your host for a very special Gut Plus Science series called In the Loop, Communicating for Maximum Leadership Impact. Our big goal is to help leaders become better communicators, because communication is your best tool for leading well. Let's go ahead and dive into this month's topic. Have you ever given much thought to your presence? And what do I even mean by that? Well, presence is all about how we approach the people that we want to connect with. Now, if you're in sales or you're in some sort of a leadership position, or you just want to establish a relationship with someone, you don't start with words. You start with your presence. Now, when we first meet someone, we tend to judge them, and we ask ourselves two questions about them. The first is, can I trust this person? The second is, can I respect this person? Now, trust is really just a measure of warmth. Respect is about whether or not we perceive the other person to be competent. Now, most people want to be seen as competent, and they typically work very hard to ensure that they're showing people that they're competent. They tend to think of warmth and trust as something that just comes along as a given. But when we're judging another person upon first meeting them, we actually tend to prioritize warmth over competence. We value people who are capable, but we only notice this after we've judged them for trustworthiness. You know, the old saying really is true. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And this is really critical for leaders. When it comes to leadership, in fact, you have likely heard this term executive presence. And you probably thought it was something that people either have or they don't have. It's sometimes when we watch a person walk into the room, we watch a leader walk into the room, and they immediately command attention. We wonder, how do they do that? Well, today I want to talk a little bit about executive presence, what it really is, what it's not, why it's important, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the controversy around it. And we'll talk about some ways that you can develop the right kind of executive presence that will help move your own leadership communication forward. So let's start. What is executive presence? Well, the definition is really just the ability to project confidence, to have clarity. Sometimes people refer to it as gravitas, and really just credibility and relational connection. It's not necessarily style or polish. Those things can be important, but that's not what we're really talking about as the essence of executive presence. It's really more about that substance that comes behind the presence. Now, here's a useful mental model you can think of. Presence equals what you are and what you believe about yourself, plus how you communicate it, plus how others perceive it. So it's important that we start from a place of self-awareness and groundedness, but we also have to consider what other people are seeing and what other people are experiencing when they have an encounter with us. Now, I also want to take a moment here to just really distinguish between executive presence and charisma. Now, charisma can feel inauthentic sometimes. Presence is really more of a stable characteristic. It's rooted in calm confidence. You have clarity, you have poise under pressure. Those are the kinds of things we're talking about when we talk about executive presence. Now, we often think of these as things that people just have, they come naturally to us, and that they're difficult for other people. But really, they're learned skills. They are things that you can influence and you can get better at as a leader. It just takes a little bit of practice. So before we get into some tips for that, we want to spend just a little bit of time talking about why it even matters. If you think about it, when you're trying to build trust with others, when you are trying to have influence over others, which really is the primary purpose of leadership, people tend to follow those that they feel are credible and who they feel are composed. People look to leaders in difficult times for answers. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have all of the answers, but you do have to project that you are in control. Now, executive presence can also have quite a bit of impact on your career. Leaders who have strong presence are typically more likely to get heard, to be elevated in their organization, and really to inspire their teams. So those are leadership characteristics that others are often looking for if they're going to be promoting you within an organization. Now, in high stakes settings, perhaps it's a crisis moment, it's a very important meeting of a board, or it's in some sort of negotiations with major clients. Those are particularly times when presence can make all the difference in you being persuasive versus being ignored by the others in the room. Now, one last thing that I think is really important for a leader when we're talking about executive presence is the idea of psychological safety. When you as a leader project executive presence, you are creating a situation in which people feel that you as a leader are present, that you are attuned to what's going on, that you are steady, and it typically will lower the anxiety in the room. So those are all things that can be very helpful as a leader. Now, I know there is some controversy around the idea of executive presence. I was recently watching a podcast with Adam Grant and Brene Brown, and Brene Brown has a recent book out called Strong Ground. And she had a few things to say about executive presence as a concept, and they weren't very good. Now, she says that she doesn't like that term, and she doesn't like for leaders to focus on executive presence because she feels that it can be code for conforming to the cultural norms of current power structures. Meaning, if our expectation of executive presence is that every leader would talk like a man or present their body like a man would, that those are not good characteristics of executive presence for us to be emulating. It doesn't put women in positions to be able to prosper and to grow as leaders. And I do see the controversy around that. I think that's why it's important for us to have a really strong definition of what executive presence truly is, and that it should always be other oriented. It's not about creating our own narcissistic bubble where we're thinking about ourselves and how we're coming across. It's really us as leaders thinking about how we can create an environment where we can be most effective when we're delivering a message to others, when we're trying to make a connection with others, and so on. Those are the things that are the most important. It's not about our own personal reputation or us looking good as leaders. Now, some researchers will argue that we're overemphasizing presence and we're underemphasizing relationships, inclusivity, and vulnerable leadership. We've talked about those characteristics on this podcast before, and I am a firm believer in exhibiting all of those as a leader. Vulnerable leadership is important, but it's always got to be balanced. And so that's where I think it's important for us to also talk about this idea of executive presence. Executive presence really sets you up for the ability to be effective in your communication as a leader. If you aren't thinking about what others are perceiving and you aren't thinking about the way that you're presenting yourself, you're probably going to leave some of your effectiveness on the table, and you will not be able to be as truly other-oriented and as focused on your team as you might otherwise be. Now, I mentioned Brene Brown and her perspective, and as I've been reading through her book, I know that she always emphasizes vulnerability as a strength and that true leadership does involve emotional courage. She talks a lot about the importance of trust. She talks a lot about the importance of being able to have difficult conversations and staying really grounded in your values. And again, those are all important things, and they should all be a part of the way that you communicate as a leader. She would typically argue, I think, about executive presence, that having a focus on that without emotional groundedness or integrity would really ring hollow with people. And I think that's true. She really focuses on the idea of vulnerability. And again, that's an important thing. And sometimes it might feel like there's a little bit of tension if a leader is looking to be confident but is internally disconnected. There could be an opportunity for some defensiveness, for some fearfulness. And she cautions that true presence is more than just a performance. Well, I agree with her. I think that it's important to think of executive presence as just one part of the overall presentation that you're making when you're delivering a message. We've talked about this before, but you can't only think about your words. You have to think about the channels and the emotions that you're expressing with those words. These are all important things to help a leader be truly effective and to truly connect with their teams. I want to just stop there for a moment and encourage you as a leader to think about the times when your presence has been something intentional, when you have taken the time to really think about your executive presence before going into a meeting or before addressing your team. Have you used that executive presence as a mask, or has it been grounded in who you really are and what you're trying to accomplish with that interaction? Take the time to look at that and to ask yourself those hard questions. And when you do, you'll find ways that you can grow as a leader in your communication. So let's talk a little bit about some of the elements that make for strong executive presence. I mentioned the word gravitas earlier. Gravitas is basically just the idea of poise under pressure. Typically, the elements of gravitas are composure. You have steady emotional regulation. You are in control of your emotions. You also present confidence in your decision making, and you are comfortable with silence. You recognize that silence and listening is all a part of your presence. It's not just about the words that you're speaking. You make time, you make space for other people. You don't rush to fill in the gaps. And when you do that, you're creating a sense of confidence and a sense of composure. And you're also signaling to other people that you invite them into the conversation. Now, another characteristic of executive presence is clarity and impact. When you have solid executive presence, you are typically very clear and decisive in your speaking. You don't use a lot of overqualifiers. You've probably heard people before who fill their sentences with things like and so, etc. All of those kinds of words are just filler words. And when you are building a strong executive presence, you should try to be very aware of those kinds of things and find ways to eliminate them from your speech. Pausing is okay. Silence is okay. Those are the kinds of things that give you more executive presence. So don't be afraid of them. Typically, also under the heading of clarity and impact, is that you are a good storyteller, that you use framing to help people understand what you're communicating. It really helps your messages be more memorable. It helps you to connect meaning to what you're saying and to the lives of the people that you are talking to. And you're also thinking about things like your tone, your pace, your vocal variety. When you take the time to be very intentional in those things, it helps you to be a clearer communicator, and it creates this presence about you that can be very comforting, and it just welcomes people. People will be paying attention to what you're talking about because they see that you're being very intentional. Another characteristic of executive presence is relational connection and authenticity. When you have empathy, when you can read the room and you understand what's going on, and then you can adapt what you're saying, you're more responsive to what you're being presented with, that increases your executive presence. You also want to show vulnerability within reason and as appropriate, but you also want to have boundaries. When you do those things, what you're doing is you're showing that you have humanity. As a leader, you are human, but you also have authority and you are not undermining that authority. So think about how you can balance vulnerability with authority. And then last, consistency between words and actions. This really should go without saying, but it's something that I see so many leaders struggle with. You have to stay true to your word. You have to build consistency between the things that you say and the things that you do. And when you do that over time, you're going to build trust. That's a really critical element, and it is what all of your executive presence is built on. Now, let's talk about some tips. How do we get there? Everyone thinks that they have the ability to present themselves with confidence, that they have the ability to be clear in their messaging and consistent, and that should just automatically mean that their executive presence is solid. But the reality is, it's all about intentionality. Over time and with practice, you can get really great at this. And so I have just a few tips for you to think about as you work to build your executive presence. So the first thing you want to do is you want to just take an audit of your executive presence. You want to get some external feedback. So I'd encourage you, ask a trusted peer or maybe someone on your leadership team. Maybe if you have a business coach, this is a great use of your coaching time. But just to ask, when I lead or when I speak, what's the felt image that I leave? What do people actually perceive versus what I intend? Ask these kinds of deeper questions and try to get this kind of feedback so that you can truly understand how other people are experiencing you. Another thing you can do is record yourself. If you're in a meeting or in a presentation, for example, record that time and go back and observe. Look at your posture. Listen to your tone. Pay attention to how you're phrasing things. What's your energy like? Are you making eye contact with other people? Are you varying up your voice, your tone? Are you pausing in good places? All of those things can help. And if you take an audit of that and ask other people for their feedback on it, it can be really, really helpful to understanding how you're coming across to other people. Another thing you'll want to do is pause and ground yourself before speaking. This is something that I have really made a concerted effort to do more of over the last 10 years or so. When you go into a meeting, before you even get in the meeting, take the time to take a breath, center yourself, decide what your intention is. What feeling or energy do you want to bring to that conversation or to that presentation? Consciously slow your rhythm. You want to slow things down and be very intentional. Do you want to bring excitement to the meeting? Do you want to share some difficult news? Those are all things that you want to think about before you go into the meeting so that you can get your face right, you can get your tone right, you can get your cadence right, and all of those things will contribute to having a leadership presence that will be helpful to you. Another tip, practice saying less and do it more intentionally. This goes back to those filler words I mentioned earlier. Just, I think, don't qualify things. I know women are especially bad with this, and we get dinged for it as leaders. People think we don't have executive presence because they hear us seem like we're unsure of ourselves. So rather than using those filter words, start to push yourself to be really comfortable with pauses that don't have anything in them. When you get ready to talk, begin with your main point, support that point, but then stop. Don't bury your message. So often we go on and we keep saying the same thing in 3 or 4 or 5 different ways. And as we do that, we lose the impact that we have. So we've got to think about what the main point is, express it, provide some justification or support for it as needed, and then stop. Another thing that can help us with our executive presence is to use stories and metaphors. These are so important because so often, especially in the business world, we are talking about complex ideas or abstract things that are difficult for people to understand. And it's especially difficult for people to understand when they are hearing it for the first time. We often think because we as leaders have been thinking about something for days or weeks and we've been mulling things over in our minds, that other people will know what we're talking about. And the truth is, they don't. They just came out of another meeting on a completely different subject. They have a sick kid at home. They have a deadline coming up by the end of the day, whatever it might be. They are not in the same frame of mind as you. So anything you can do to help make the information you're sharing relevant and easy to digest and easy to remember. This is one thing that stories are so great about. Stories help create some emotion and some connection that just sheer facts and information do not. So think about how you can share those. And they can be personal stories, but they should always be brief and relevant. Sometimes, speaking of storytelling, we think that we don't have enough stories. We don't have a good story to help illustrate this point. But maybe we know someone else's story. It's okay to share other people's stories. And I talked about this at length in an earlier podcast last year where we talked about good leaders being great storytellers. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that. I tell some funny stories on myself, as well as some stories that I've heard from clients and friends and other people over the years. And they are so helpful to making a point. They don't necessarily have to be your own lived experience if you can tell them well and if they're relevant. So think about other stories, perhaps. As many of you know, I am a huge reader. I read lots and lots of business books, and I frequently see great examples and great stories and great metaphors in these books that I read. And so I frequently jot those stories down, or I just recall them when I'm sharing with others a particular point and there's a relevant story that I heard from an author. So think about those kinds of things as well. There could be stories from your kids. There could be stories from your neighbors and your friends. There could be stories from past experiences that you've had. It could really be anything, but it's just got to be something that's relevant so that people can connect to it. That's what we're looking for, is the connection. Now, something else to keep in mind when you are building your executive presence is, as I mentioned earlier about vulnerability, to show some vulnerability, but to do it strategically. Be okay with sharing what you don't know, maybe where you're learning things. People appreciate that in a leader. You can also ask questions aloud. As you're in a meeting, for example, tell the people in the group, I'm wrestling with XYZ. What do you think about this? It's a great way to show that you are thinking through hard, complex topics, but you don't necessarily feel like you have all of the answers all of the time, and you're inviting other people into the conversation. Showing vulnerability does not necessarily mean exposing weakness or even unpreparedness. You don't want to do that. What it just means is showing a human side. You can often turn vulnerability into a strength by turning it back to the other person, acknowledging that you don't have an answer or that you're still formulating an answer, but immediately asking the other person for their take on the situation. I love doing this with people because as I've gotten older, I've realized being a leader doesn't mean having all the answers. It means surrounding yourself and encouraging others to help you come to the right conclusions. And there is lots of wisdom in the counsel of many. So draw on that. People appreciate that. And many times they have ideas that are great and that can be super helpful. And they're things that we may not never have come up with on our own. Another tip for you: practice what's called listening presence. Many times we think about our eye contact or our speech or our posture when we're thinking about presenting, but we aren't necessarily thinking about our presence when we're just in a listening mode. This is really, really important. This could be even more important than the presence that you exhibit when you're presenting. When other people speak, stay fully present. Think about your eye contact. Make sure that you're minimizing any sort of interruptions. Paraphrase what you're hearing from that person to help confirm your understanding. This builds so much relational credibility. Now, I learned this really a couple of decades ago. I started making a very intentional effort to stop what I was doing anytime someone would walk into my office and make sure that I was really listening to them. I could easily get distracted by my email or by the phone or the things on my desk. So what I did was I went so far as anytime someone walked in my office to talk to me, I would push away from my desk. I would even stand up and I would move away from my desk toward that person. I feel like this really gave them the sense that I was focused on them, that I truly was listening, and that I was putting them first. And I think this is so important for leaders to do. Something else that we want to do to really increase our executive presence is to expand our comfort zone in a very intentional way. So if you don't typically present a lot or talk in front of large groups, volunteer for an opportunity to do that. Get outside of your normal routine. Find an opportunity to present or to bring a group together. Be on a panel. Find a way to interact with other departments or other groups in a cross-functional way. Rehearse that opportunity and then debrief after. Go back to your accountability partner. Go back to someone else who was involved in that and get their take on how that went. Another tip that I always like to share is to align your actions with your values. Be sure that you're exhibiting integrity. I already talked a little bit about the idea of aligning actions with your words, but go even a step further and be consistent with what your stated values are. If you are a leader of an organization and you have stated company values, go back to those constantly and be sure that your words and your actions align with those. And here's the thing: if you have a misstep or an inconsistency, just own it. We're all human. It's completely fine. People will understand and they will be very forgiving, but only if you acknowledge it, only if you bring it up and say, I was inconsistent here. I apologize. And this is where we're going now. Whenever you do that, that reinforces trust for people. Another tip that I'll leave you with: physical presence cues. You want to think about, again, your posture. Are you standing up straight? Are you sitting upright? You don't want tension to be evident on your body. You also want to think about your gestures. You want to be deliberate with any hand gestures. You don't want to be fidgety. You don't want to overdo it. So think about how you're using gestures and how they can help you increase your executive presence. Now, also, you want to think about your voice. I mentioned the idea of tone earlier, but even things like volume. One thing I think is really important is for leaders to think about their volume. It is so frustrating to others If you are in a group setting, for example, and you are a soft talker, and even when you realize it and you project, but then you immediately go back to a soft voice, that can be very difficult for people, not only to understand and to clearly hear what you're talking about, but it's a ding on your leadership presence. And so you want to be sure that you are really thinking about that and how you can be clear and understood by people. And sometimes it's just a volume issue. You also want to think about the space around you. You don't want to shrink into corners. You want to take a stance. You want to take a place in the room. Now, there's a really great book that goes into this in much more depth that I would highly recommend to you. I'll put something in the show notes about this, but it's called Presence, and it's by Amy Cuddy. Now, in it, she talks about physical space and how you can use it to your advantage. This sounds a little funny and it might feel a little awkward at first, but she touches on things such as how to stand in a power pose, which I know sounds like, is that authentic? But the reality is, we communicate so much with our body when we are meeting in person and even in an online experience. So we should think about our body. What are we doing with our body? How are we standing? How are we sitting? Those things are all so, so important. So I'd highly encourage you to read Amy Cuddy's book on that. So as we wrap up today, I just want to encourage you. Think about executive presence as an important element, but it's just one element of how you communicate as a leader. Executive presence is more than style. It really is about substance. It's about clarity. It's about relational grounding. And it's really about integrity. Do you want people to believe that you are a warm person so that they can connect to you? And do you want them to believe that you're a competent person so that they have credibility in you? Those are important things. Now, I've included a PDF in the show notes that gives some of these tips that we just covered. So if that can be a helpful tool to you, I would encourage you to download that. I would even challenge you to pick one or two of the tips from the list and try them in your next meeting. See what works for you and what doesn't, and adjust wherever you need to. I'd also like to invite you to give me some feedback. Give me some idea of what's working for you. Tell me if you try some of these tips and how they impact your ability to communicate and to connect. I would love to hear more. And if you find something that we didn't talk about today, I would love to hear that too, so we can add that to the resources that we share. Now, as I often do, I've mentioned before that I've read a couple of great books that cover this topic from various angles. I mentioned one already, Amy Cuddy's book called Presence, but there's another one I also want to take just a moment to mention as well. And the other one is called Captivate: The Science of Succeeding with People. Now, this book is by a woman named Vanessa Van Edwards. I've heard her speak, and she's just so engaging, very funny. And she's done quite a bit of research on things like body language, facial expressions, and how those things are communicating, whether you realize it or not, and how you can be more aware and adjust those things so that you don't create an opportunity for distrust or confusion with people that you're communicating with. Now, as we wrap up today, I just want to encourage you. Leadership can be overwhelming, but you've got this. Remember that creating and maintaining connections with your team members is one of the best ways that you can find success as a leader. It's the most important thing. And you can do this with clear and compelling communication. Thanks for listening.
We just left the world a little bit better. Now, go do something with it.